Welcome, everyone, to the Dad's Doomsday Guide. Today, we're happy to have on Randall Fitzgerald. Randall is the author of 10 books and more than 50 books as a ghostwriter. He spent 35 years as a newspaper and magazine journalist, as well as 2 decades as a roving editor for Reader's Digest. He has written investigative feature articles for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Randall's newest book is Alien in the Mirror, Extraterrestrial Contact Theories and Evidence, where he dives into the controversial subject of alien contact, which he's here to discuss today. Welcome, Randall. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be with you, fellow Earthling.
So, I guess it was really interesting when I found you, and there's been so much in the headlines lately about UFOs and disclosure and all this different stuff. And I really enjoyed your book because you kind of lay out all these different theories, all the different evidence, and kind of almost like a chronological order. I guess to start, what got you into, because you have quite the resume in terms of writing, investigative journalism, what got you into UFOs? And were you always a believer, or is this something you kind of grew in kind of once you started looking at the evidence? Or are you not a believer, I should say? Because you definitely show both sides of the argument in the book.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm definitely, Scott, an agnostic, always have been. Actually, I got my start in this subject area in order to date myself. I was a teenager growing up in East Texas in the early 60s, and I became a member of NICAP, the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, in 1964. And I started receiving their monthly newsletter, the NICAP Investigator. And I was curious about all aspects of life and the nature of consciousness and whether there's life in the universe and so forth. And so the NICAP organization got me started in terms of stimulating my interest. And I vowed at that point that someday I would get more actively involved in the subject area. And that day came about 12 years later, 1978, when I secured modest financial backing and started a magazine in Washington, D.C. called Second Look. And Second Look was a monthly magazine devoted to 3 areas of inquiry, the first being the origins of civilization, the second being the nature of consciousness, and the third being the search for life elsewhere in the universe. And I recruited a co-editor in Britain by the name of Robert Temple, who had written a international bestseller called The Sirius Mystery, about the Dogon tribe in Mali and some astronomical information which they had, which seemed to be not in their league technologically. And so we started the magazine. It operated for about 2 years, and that was sort of the apex of my deep involvement in this subject area. And then since then, I, as a journalist, have sort of dived in periodically, but for the most part, I would consider myself an agnostic. I'm somewhere in between.
Now, you mentioned the Dogon tribe, and I believe I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, but Berosus, is that the Babylonian scholar?
Yes, that was the Babylonian scholar that always intrigued me, who was writing about the time of Alexander the Great, and who had written about the origins of the Sumerian civilization and the gods of Sumeria, which were given all of these attributes that were not really godlike. They were more not human-like, but just visitor-like. Mm-hmm. And so that had always intrigued me.
Yeah, I think you mentioned for people, because I've always heard about the Sumerians, and everybody tries to attribute, I guess, for people who live under a rock, I guess, or who don't really follow the subject, what is the argument? And do you view the argument that they there was outside influence? I know that I think it's Graham Hancock, I've heard on like Rogan, different people purport the idea that there was some either pre-civilization to all these different, because of different parts of the world, I guess, right? Sumer, Peru, like there's different aspects that they all share in common, but there's this one civilization bringer that kind of showed people how the mathematics or numbers or planetary things. What is, I guess, the story or the argument supporting Sumerians being the apex of that? And then I guess to you, is that the most plausible ancient astronaut theory out there right now?
No, not necessarily most plausible, but if we look at the history of the theories, starting with the books that were written in the 1950s and beyond, Erich von Däniken in the 60s was the best-selling author in the ancient astronaut subject area, but he had lots of predecessors who had written in this subject area. And the Sumerians were intriguing because this was seemingly the first form of written communication that any civilization had produced. And because the legends that they had encoded in their writings seemed so fitting of something otherworldly. We've got the legends in Greek mythology, of course, and the Egyptians with Osiris and so forth. But with the Sumerians, much with the Babylonian scholar Berosus, they talked in terms of gods more as visitors, more as something that was not human, yet had human attributes. And so it was more of a case that was being made in these early books that maybe civilization had origins which mainstream archaeologists and historians have overlooked.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe, because you touch on a lot of different, I guess, theories, ancient astronaut theories, and some you can't help when you read them, you go, this seems fantastical. Like, what's the evidence behind this? And it's so dense, the topic. Now, when you mentioned the Dogon tribe, they were supposed to be, I guess, theoretically descendants of the Sumerians, possibly, and then their knowledge of star systems. But then I think in the book you mentioned the anthropologists, they ended up contradicting each other. Somebody visited them later and said, well, hey, they actually didn't think this way. Has there been any more details? Your book's recent, so I imagine it's pretty up to date in that sense. But was there, when you looked at the evidence, were you leaning toward one direction or another?
Well, Robert Temple, again, my co-editor of Second Look, when he wrote his book, The Serious Mystery, that was an international bestseller. It was published first in Germany. It came out in about 1976, and he was looking at not only the history of the Dogon tribe as it had been related by these two French anthropologists who had spent time in the 1920s and 30s with the tribe and had decoded a lot of their mythology. But Temple was also looking at the possible astronomical evidence as it was filtered through ancient Egypt to the Dogon. The Dogon, their ancestors had a lot of contact with ancient Egypt. And in turn, Egypt had contact with the Sumerians. So there was a cross-fertilization of information that seemingly occurred in ancient times. And Temple tried to trace all of those interconnections to show that there was at least a circumstantial evidence that the Dogon, through their oral tradition, had been preserving astronomical information that had been lost and that in antiquity had been related by visitors from the Sirius star system.
Now, do you think because that was done, I believe in the 50s originally, correct, when those anthropologists were out there, do you think that finding any definitive answer in that respect is kind of lost in terms of, is that tribe dying out now? I imagine as we go forward in the future, these things are going to be less possible to kind of...
Well, as I tried to relate in the book, the controversy after the Temple book was published had to do, first of all, with the true nature of the oral tradition in the Dogon tribe. Later anthropologists in the 1990s who visited the Dogon and attempted to interview some of the remaining elders who had had the initial contact with the French anthropologists. These later anthropologists were unable to verify some of the initial information. So the controversy got further stimulated. And of course, when the Temple book came out initially, there were a lot of skeptical scientists in the mainstream, as you can imagine. who, as well as anthropologists, who tried to dispel some of the case that was being made by Temple by saying that it was demeaning it, of course, that it was absurd and there was no way that this sort of information would have been preserved by a seemingly primitive tribe for all of these many generations.
Mm-hmm.
But we now know that with many of these tribes, their oral traditions, as evidenced by research that's been done with the Aborigines in Australia, a lot of these oral traditions have stayed true to the original source material.
Mm-hmm.
It was difficult, really, to dispel what Temple made by way of a case for the Dogon and their oral tradition, just based on trying to undermine that tradition.
Yeah, it was quite striking reading that. It's funny, like with most of the stuff, like you do describe yourself as an agnostic, and I would probably describe myself as the same, because you can read an argument or a case that is made, like in the Dogons, and I can come away thinking, "Oh my God, that's the answer." And then you read quickly, "Oh," and then there was other anthropologists who came and casted doubt, and then you kind of get deflated, and you're like, "Well, okay, maybe there's not." And there's always seemed to be a back and forth. What gets me is the, I guess, collection of evidence, I guess, all the different civilizations, all the different references, different artwork. Do you think too much is made of like the cave art with like beings with big heads? I mean, how much of this is just UFO fanatics, and I don't say that disparagingly, trying to read in what they believe into this stuff? Or is this objectively something that you think, with all your investigations and all the people you talk to, that begs a lot of attention? Like there is something that we're missing in terms of the ancient history of the human civilization.
I've always felt intuitively that there was something to the ancient astronaut theories, that there was a core basis of information that was preserved. But at the same time, I've always tried to weigh the evidence as much as you do, and looking at the pros and cons, and taking into account that a lot of people who call themselves skeptics and debunkers are really cynics.
Yeah.
They talk in terms of being skeptics, but skepticism is about the fair-minded evaluation of both sides of an argument to reach a conclusion, even if the conclusion is a big question mark. But in the case of a lot of people calling themselves skeptics and debunkers, there was in this underlying cynicism that what they were looking at was impossible, that it was impossible for extraterrestrial visitation to have occurred in ancient times, that it's impossible for space to be traversed given the circumstances involved in a vehicle going at the speed of light. All of this demeaning with this underlying idea that it's impossible leads a lot of skeptics and debunkers into the territory in which they malign the intentions and the motivations of the people who put forth these theories. Mm-hmm. And that becomes a toxic environment, which over the years and decades, I've always tried to do my best to dispel, because it's not helpful to a fair-minded argument to try to always impugn the motives of the people that are talking in terms of having had an encounter or a sighting or have an idea that's on the cutting edge of ideas about what this phenomenon entails.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And it's kind of driven me crazy with this most recent stuff, which we'll get to later, is when you have either physicists or cosmologists come out and they're just immediately, one that comes to mind is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who immediately comes out and just starts like dumping on the idea that anything would want to see us and that we're and it's like,
he's the new Carl Sagan.
Yeah, like how would you even assume that you would know their motivations if this is indeed true? I don't know. It just, to me, you're not even, like you say, open to the idea that you could be wrong, or even if you have like a bias, which everybody does, right? You might slightly believe it's probably true or slightly think it's BS or whatever. But when these people come in like Mick West, professional debunkers, but it's like you said, it's just, you just don't believe it. You're trying to disprove everything to fit what you already think. And that to me is just, it's sad and it's a disservice because there's people like, I think us who just want to know the truth and want to gather information. And yeah, if you can debunk something, do it. I think it helps believers too. But I feel like it's become, like you said, so toxic. And I don't know if you're on Twitter ever, but like the UFO,
Try not to be.
yeah, social media in general. And I was really, when this all originally came out again with the UAP report and everything, I was really interested in trying to consume a lot of information, but it quickly became just watching people argue over the most silly things and whether a document's legitimate or not. Like the whole phenomenon just hinged on that one piece of information. So I had to kind of remove myself from it. I don't know. I guess if I kind of want to pivot to some of these, I guess, examples you use in the book, and kind of maybe that'll kind of help bring about some of the other questions that I have regarding this most recent stuff that's coming out. You discuss the Arizona lights, and I think you said you covered that. And actually spoke to a lot of people who actually saw this happen.
Indeed. What transpired was back in the 90s, I was a roving editor for Reader's Digest magazine. And I wanted to get involved again in the subject of this phenomenon, whatever it is that involves UFOs and abductions and so forth. And so I proposed an article to my higher up editors at the magazine in the wake of the March 13th, 1997 Arizona lights sighting, to do an in-depth article. And so I was given the go-ahead to spend a few months interviewing witnesses. And there were three types of witnesses to what transpired that night that I wanted to focus on. First category were people on the ground who had seen the formation of 5 lights and had looked at the formation through binoculars. And the second category of witnesses were pilots in the air that night, because it was a very well-traveled route from Phoenix to Las Vegas and other cities. And so I wanted to interview the pilots that might have seen the lights or interacted with whoever was piloting the lights. And the third category, I wanted to interview air traffic controllers who were on duty that night at Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, but also at other airports in Arizona and Nevada. So I found witnesses in all three categories. I interviewed more than 50 people altogether. And here's what really intrigued me. So when the lights were first seen, they were coming from the northwestern sky in the direction of the Hale-Bopp comet, which was very bright and visible in the clear sky that night. And it drew people out by the thousands looking up at the sky, which I found intriguing about the timing. And the people that I interviewed who were in the northern part of Arizona, who had looked at the lights and the formation with binoculars, all told me that they saw space and sky and then stars later at night between those 5 lights. It didn't seem to be one single solid object. And in fact, there was one video done of the 5 lights. And in the video, which is only 20 or 30 seconds long, but you can see the 5th light trailing behind the others and then moving faster to catch up, as if they were 5 individual planes. So the second category of witnesses, pilots in the sky that night, I interviewed the crew of an Air America Air West plane, which was flying from Phoenix to Las Vegas. And there were 2 pilots, and there was a third pilot who was on board. I interviewed the 3 of them, and they claimed that they interacted with the pilots in that formation of 5 lights. They claimed that they had radio transmission back and forth because they were curious at the same time as everyone on the ground was. What are these lights? Because they're flying seemingly, and according to these pilots, the 5 lights in the formation were flying with their landing lights on, and there was a single light in the nose of each of the 5 pointed down toward the ground, which was highly unusual and which was a violation of FAA regulations. So during the interaction that occurred, according to the America Air West crew, they asked these pilots, who are you? And where are you going? And the response was that they were snowbird pilots and that they were flying to the southern part of Arizona. And according to the individuals that were on duty that night at Sky Harbor Airport, who were air traffic controllers, they did not see this formation of 5 planes on the radar. And there are reasons for that. Apparently, when those 5 lights got over the city and the suburbs of Phoenix, they were flying at a lower altitude than they were in the northern part of Arizona. So that would be one reason why the Sky Harbor air traffic controllers didn't see them. But then we've got the other aspect of this, which is there were so many witnesses in the Phoenix metropolitan area who looked up in the sky and thought they saw a single object. They thought they saw 5 lights on a single solid object. I interviewed many of these people, and they swore that these were not individual lights. They were not individual planes. It was one single solid object. And then, as the light formation got closer to the border with Mexico, flying in that part of Arizona, witnesses who were driving along the interstate highway, and this entire light formation, by the way, followed the interstate highway the entire way, which was interesting. Mm-hmm. Those witnesses started looking at the lights with binoculars and started saying, oh, these were 5 individual planes, 5 individual lights. So my question was, how could 5 independent lights seen in one part of Arizona become a solid object over the metropolitan area of Phoenix and then become 5 independent lights again once those lights left the metropolitan area? And there were atmospheric conditions that might have accounted for this. It was a clear night in much of Arizona that night, but over the suburbs of Phoenix, it was hazy. It's possible that there was some weird atmospheric phenomena that made these 5 independent lights look like a single solid object. But there was another alternative. And that was, I started looking at holographic technology. And it was pretty much in its infancy in the late 90s. Mm-hmm. But when you come and look at black budget operations in the military, which are usually technologically about 10 years ahead of what we see in the mm-hmm. private sector and publicly, it began to seem to be possible that there was some holographic ongoing experiment. And this particular sighting of the 5 lights may have been holographic technology being tested between 5 planes that wanted to be seen, that were using the Hale-Bopp comet as an opportunity to bring attention to themselves. They were flying along Interstate Highway, again, to bring attention, flying over a metropolitan area, again, to bring attention. And they go all the way to Tucson, Arizona, and to just outside of Tucson is this Fort Wahuchka, if I get the pronunciation right. You don't have to have inside sources to find out that this particular fort has for decades been the psychological warfare training center for all of the armed forces, and it has an airfield there. And as far as I could tell, those 5 lights or this single object, whichever you prefer, landed at that airfield. So where did the lights originate? Well, snowbirds are also a nickname for a Canadian air performance team based out of Saskatchewan. And I interviewed the members of that team and the officers in charge, and all the Canadians claim it wasn't us. We weren't there. So where did the planes come from? Well, in tracing the original that night of March 13th sighting reports, there were sighting reports in southern Nevada that the lights were coming from the direction of Area 51. Mm-hmm. And connect the dots between the possible origin of the planes being Area 51, then it becomes a little more plausible that it might have been a psychological warfare operation.
Which is insane. And thank you for doing that, by the way, the chronological order of all that. Which begs the question, though, it's kind of crazy to think that the government would be doing that in, I guess, relatively recent times. Not that they haven't before, or that they're not capable of that, which everybody I think would agree, especially today with how cynical people are of government, that they would try to do something on its own civilians. But just if that got out, that they were, doing psychological tests on a mass population, the ramifications of that, and that kind of trickles down to all this different stuff. You think that's a risk based on everything you've kind of looked at with this phenomenon that they would take and they would use the UFO kind of, I guess that's still in kind of the time period before kind of, mass cell phones and the kind of like where now I feel like if they are using some of that psychological stuff or testing new technology on civilians, it's going to bite them in the butt a little bit. Do you feel like this is definitely in the wheelhouse of stuff that you've seen in other cases as well?
Well, let's look at the history as I do in the book. Alien in the Mirror, what I tried to do is trace the origins of every imaginable theory and all the evidence connected to the various theories, including the psychological warfare conspiracy sorts of ideas that have percolated in the UFO phenomenon field from the 1950s on. It was interesting that in 1997, the same year that we had the Arizona lights, the CIA released what had previously been classified. That was an internal study that was done. And that internal study that was released, which I talk about in the book, revealed how from the 1950s on, CIA officers had impersonated Air Force officers and had gone out and interviewed UFO witnesses, especially military witnesses and civilian pilot witnesses, and had attempted to convince them, again, posing as Air Force officers, but really being the CIA manipulating the situation, trying to convince these witnesses that what they had seen was not a UFO, but rather something that was natural in origin, like a meteor or the planet Venus or whatever it might be, often very absurd because many of these witnesses were trained witnesses, and they would just laugh in the faces of these CIA officers dressed in Air Force uniforms. But there was a hidden agenda here, and the hidden agenda had to do with the Cold War and had to do with Area 51 and the SR-71 Blackbird and other spy planes that were flying out of Area 51 that sometimes were mistaken for UFOs, especially by pilots in the sky. So the CIA and the Air Force, both agencies wanted to confuse witnesses and muddy the waters of the entire UFO phenomenon in order to push this hidden agenda to keep the Soviet Union confused about what we did or didn't know about this particular phenomenon. So there was an ongoing disinformation campaign that in 1997 the CIA admitted to, which had ended up creating not just confusion, but had undermined the credibility and the integrity of a lot of respectable witnesses who were subject to public ridicule as a result of this disinformation campaign.
Mm-hmm. Really sad, because you look at the history of it, and I guess that's one of the arguments that I would have, that present day, there's no incentive for the government, in my opinion, to be honest about this, because either one, they've lied about, alien visitation and destroyed people's lives by, either convincing them or shaming them that what they saw wasn't real, or you have them covering, black projects and secrets and ruining people's lives. Like, there's no like good way out for them, which, we can get to that in terms of the present day disclosure thing. But do you feel then that the Arizona lights, in your opinion, because to me, the case you made pretty much said to me felt like, oh, this is a human concoction by the U.S. government, and would you believe that too, based on the evidence that you saw that this was not alien visitation?
I believe that I could be wrong. So once again, I'm going to resort to my agnostic perspective as a journalist, trying to weigh all of the information. I think the case I made is somewhat persuasive, that because of the great divergence in witness reports about what was seen that night, between it being 5 individual lights, individual planes, as opposed to one solid object with 5 lights on it. But because of the conflict and looking at the gray area of what it could have been by way of human activity, and because I don't think the military would ever admit to this having been a psychological warfare test, because of what the reaction would have been in Congress, as well as in the public. So given all of that uncertainty, I still think that the evidence would seem to indicate that it wasn't something otherworldly.
You mentioned the Soviet Union and kind of like the whole culture about disinformation and keeping people confused and wanting to keep the Soviet Union confused. But at the meantime, I guess these things are happening in Russia too. And I think something you mentioned in the book too is USOs, which is underwater unidentified craft or things that pop up on radar. How prominent is this in Russia and other countries that you have seen? From what I gather, it's just as common as here, or is it more common in America? It's hard, I know, because whether it's a dictatorship or whoever, and the information getting out to the public. But do you see this phenomenon as common in other countries?
Yes. And let me respond to your question several ways. One, in my book, I summarize many other books that were written about what has transpired in other countries. Obviously, a lot of authors have written about what has occurred in Britain, different cases involving especially the 1980 Rendlesham. But then we have Brazil. Brazil has always been a hotbed for UFO sightings, and a number of books that I summarize were written about the UFO cases in Brazil. And also in Russia and the former Soviet Union. China is another example. We don't hear a lot about China, but there have been some books that pass the censors and have been released in the West, which talk in terms of Chinese UFOs. I think what made the United States so unique, aside from the publicity given beginning in 1947 to what happened at Roswell, and also with the Kenneth Arnold sightings in the state of Washington, where we came up with the term UFO, an unidentified flying object. Because so much publicity was given in the United States, and then it became a worldwide phenomenon, that we've always had the microscope and the telescope of public attention in this country focus on this subject area in a way that it hasn't been in many other countries. most of the rest of the world has caught up to us since then, since the 40s and the 50s. But initially, it was thought to be mostly a American phenomenon, simply because our publicity machine around it, with all the books that were published and so forth, was in high gear.
Yeah, I know you mentioned the Rendlesham Forest, and that was really fascinating because of who was involved. And I know you mentioned the government, CIA, posing as Air Force, going toward military personnel who've seen things and trying to dissuade them.
Mm-hmm.
Do you notice in that case in particular, I think you mentioned truth serum was even used on some of these?
Right. Yeah, Colonel Charles Halt, who was the base commander at that time, has, of course, come out publicly, and he's been in many public forums talking about this case, as have many of the airmen that were on duty on the course of those, I think it was 3 nights altogether that this phenomenon occurred.
And what year was that?
1980.
1980.
Yeah, that was December 1980. So a number of the witnesses were apparently, according to their accounts, given truth serum by investigators, military investigators, to try to determine whether or not they were telling the truth. Now, of course, there's a theory. I don't necessarily subscribe to it, but there is a theory that what transpired over the course of those nights in that forest and outside the base was a security reconnaissance operation in which outside individuals who were brought in created the circumstances to test base security using the appearance of a UFO and a sighting to see whether or not the security measures would hold up and whether or not the witnesses would break under pressure in their accounts. A case can be made that maybe that happened, much as with the Arizona Lights, that there was some psychological warfare aspect testing operation involved. But again, it's one of those gray areas. I tend to think that Colonel Halt and the other witnesses involved are credible people, and the stories that they've told seem to have more consistencies than inconsistencies.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned that, and I maybe I'm confusing. I think it happened over, like you said, a course of 3 nights, so I'm not sure which one with this was, but medical records disappeared, tree sap samples from that area disappeared. I mean, they had an up-close view of this thing in like one of the cases. I find it's so hard to imagine that if they're running a psychological operation, they're not, it's this, there's just so many missing pieces to this. And even if you wanted to hide it, I don't know, wouldn't it be easier just to go to these military and say, hey, this was part of an operation. You don't need to run to the media and make this whole spin narrative. Like, what's the point of spinning this complicated story instead of just being upfront with the people that you're actually interacting with? Because I think they do that. I heard that some of the pilots with the Tic Tac who mentioned that, hey, if we ever come across a black project or something that's highly classified, they tell us after, have us sign something, and then it's, it's part of your country, and you're obviously pro your country because, for intelligence reasons and military reasons. So I wouldn't that be an easier route? I mean, does that show kind of, I guess, the confusion around this whole subject is what is an operation? What is really something that the U.S. military or British is worried about?
Yes, I agree with you. However, in the case of Rendlesham in 1980, there was also another government involved. That was the British military and the British government. So it wasn't just the Americans. So that was a complicating factor in terms of the subsequent investigation. Whereas with the Tic Tac, I mean, it was just U.S. Navy and probably CIA. I suspect that some of those plainclothes people that interviewed some of the witnesses were CIA in the aftermath.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the Tic Tac stuff is so. You have such high level people like Fravor. They've seen so many things, probably so many different projects, been involved in so much with the military. It's hard to. I mean, that's another one where I think the case was. made for holographic, or I mean, I've heard it was a missile. It was like all these different things, and they're like, no, that was not. So I know there was Project Blue Book, which was geared toward, debunking a lot of this stuff.
Mhm.
And I know there's a lot of controversy and discussion about what's currently going on today. And there's tapes about, talks about somebody showed up on the carrier for the Tic Tac sighting and like took tapes. And there's like a bunch of argument over that and who actually showed up to interview these people. So the
Mhm.
CIA is actively, in your opinion, involved in getting information, or is there still an element of trying to convince these people that they didn't see what they saw? Have you heard getting any kind of wind of that kind of still going on, or is it solely just, let's collect what happened in the interviews and that's it?
Certainly, there does seem to be over time, over the decades, a transformation in perspective and military operational outlook on the part of both the CIA, NSA, all the various acronym agencies, DIA. They have undergone transformations in disclosure, as limited as it still remains. They've undergone transformations in terms of personnel involved. Back in the 50s, many people don't realize that the primary UFO group, NICAP, was formed by military and CIA personnel for the most part. All of the original founders were involved with the military industrial establishment of this country. And so that raised subsequently, not at the time, but subsequently, a lot of red flags among conspiracy theorists as to the true motivation of these individuals after leaving CIA and leaving the military. Why did they get involved with a civilian UFO group? Was the hidden agenda there that this was a funnel that was being used to collect information and funnel it to the CIA and the military? Was this simply a front group? Those questions have persisted over time. And I was able in the 1970s with Second Look magazine to interview some of these people that were the founders. Admiral Hillenkotter, for instance, who had been very high in the U.S. Navy, was one of the co-founders. And he always claimed that he had an interest in UFOs since World War II and the reports of the Foo Fighters. So his involvement later on, after leaving the military, was part of his personal transition. And I got reports from many others. Senator Barry Goldwater. We can talk about Roswell a little bit later if you choose. But I interviewed Senator Goldwater a number of times, and his chief science advisor was a former high-ranking CIA officer who had an interest in UFOs during the period that he was within the agency. So you had over time, almost like the creation within each of these agencies of little cult groups. You had UFO believers and you had UFO skeptics who would come together in these informal ways, and sometimes formally, institutionally, within the various agencies, and would share information about their findings and the agency's findings about the UFO phenomenon. And one organization, the U.S. Navy, Naval Intelligence, that I document in my book, beginning in the 1950s, whenever there would be contactees who would emerge, who might have some link to an extraterrestrial intelligence and they were channeling information. I recount a case of a housewife, a woman in Maine, Frances Swan, who was visited repeatedly by teams of naval intelligence officers during the 1950s because they thought she might have a channel to an extraterrestrial intelligence.
Was that the AFA?
AFA. Yes. She claimed that she was in touch with an extraterrestrial intelligence named AFA.
I was reading that and I was like, I have to admit, I was getting a little creeped out because there's a weird cross between paranormal and it almost seems demonic, to be honest. Because we interviewed a Catholic exorcist who discussed that whole topic, and then we talked to a psychiatrist who was going through their medical evaluations of some of these people, and what you were describing in the book as her symptoms was like very similar to that. And then we can talk about Skinwalker Ranch and some of the weird paranormal poltergeist type stuff that follows people home, apparently. But then I know you go into like reasons to doubt what she was talking about, but then, some CIA people saw something out of a window that she said to look. I mean, it gets really, really creepy and very strange. But I sorry to interrupt you there. I just had to point out that, and I don't know if you find a link between is it paranormal? Is that kind of funneled into a certain area, like the Skinwalker type personal experience they have with something, and separate from, hey, Tic Tac, visible ships type thing? Are those do you hold those separately, or are they to you?
No, I maybe at one time in the 1970s, I did see it all as separate, but no longer. As I recount in the epilogue of my book, I tend to think that all these various phenomena are wrapped up together in one phenomenon. And it has to do with an interaction with human consciousness. That human consciousness and what we really don't know, all of the mysteries of human consciousness are wrapped up in these subjects because there's an ongoing interaction, which I recount in the book with multiple examples. In the 1950s, going back to Francis Swan and AFA and the naval intelligence officers who would fly up over the course of a weekend and did this multiple times. There were 3 or 4 different teams of naval intelligence officers that went from Washington, D.C. to Berwick, Maine, where Francis Swan was located, and would spend a weekend with her, asking her science questions. And she would channel the answers. And most of the time, what she answered was wrong and absurd. But every once in a while, she would answer a science question accurately. And that would get them stimulated to believe possibly she has some connection here that we need to be looking more closely at. Now, I interviewed Francis Swan. I went up to Maine, and she was still alive in the 70s, and I spent time with her, and I got access to all of her notes, her daily notes, where she was interacting with former admirals of the U.S. Navy, the top of the line naval intelligence officers. She had the entire naval intelligence unit on board with her being a credible, possible connection, despite the fact that she was answering wrongly so many of these science questions. Now, what Francis Swan told me was quite interesting. She discovered that all of these naval intelligence officers were Christian scientists within naval intelligence who were UFO believers, who were looking for evidence to support their point of view. And that's why they had latched on to Francis Swan, hoping that she would be their connection to the ultimate answers of what UFOs are.
And does she still feel like what she was experiencing was indeed an entity, an objective entity?
Yes, she felt that way. And as I recount as a story in the book, one of the naval intelligence officers asked if she would teach him how to channel this entity named AFA. And so she did. And he began using automatic writing to channel answers to questions that were posed to him. And he began to believe, this naval intelligence officer, that he was in touch with AFA. So he went back to Washington, D.C., and told his superiors, who were rather dubious. So they set up a performance at a CIA office in downtown Washington, D.C. In the late 50s, which I recount in the book. There were several CIA officers present, including Arthur Lundahl, who was in charge of the CIA's photographic division. There was a memo, CIA memo, that was written about this particular encounter and performance. And during the course of it, the CIA officers asked the naval intelligence officer to produce a UFO outside their window there in the daylight in downtown Washington, D.C. And during the course of being in this trance and channeling this alleged entity, the officer said, "Go to the window." So the CIA officers go to the window, and according to this memo, which I reproduce in the book, they saw a bright, silvery object in the sky outside the window. And one of the officers immediately called air traffic control for the Washington, D.C. region and asked if there were any radar locks on an object in the sky. And he gave the direction in the sky and coordinates. And the response was, "We're sorry, we can't answer your question because that radar quadrant is blacked out right now." That for some reason they weren't able to get radar returns.
That's
the
so
object, whatever it was, the light disappeared. So this is all recounted in this 13 or 14 page memo that was passed around between the CIA and naval intelligence and the Project Blue Book officers that were involved, who were also sent in to investigate. So there became a controversy within these three agencies, the Air Force and Project Blue Book, Naval Intelligence, the CIA, about what really happened that day and whether or not this woman, this housewife in southern Maine, Frances Swan, had a legitimate connection to an extraterrestrial entity. And so it's still a mystery to this day. I interviewed Arthur Lundahl after he retired from the CIA and asked him to verify the information in the CIA memo. And he refused to do it. He claimed that he had not seen a UFO out the CIA office window that day. He claimed that he was just trying to help a naval intelligence officer friend who he thought was psychologically troubled. He basically dismissed it. But then everything got a little murkier because Lundahl became friends with Jacques Vallée, a legendary scientist in the UFO field, who, by the way, writes the foreword to my book, The Mirror.
That was very cool.
And Jacques Vallée tells me years later and verifies to me again just a few months ago in our conversations that Arthur Lundahl had confessed to him that everything in the CIA memo was correct. But Lundahl had lied to me because he didn't want to see his name in print being associated. But privately, he would confess it to Jacques Vallée that he had indeed seen something he couldn't explain, and that this entire incident had occurred, and it remained a mystery to this day.
As like that kind of stuff like goes, wow, there's something going on, when you have so many different people trying to, I understand because of the stigma, don't want to come out, like you said, be in print, but then behind the scenes, and you hear that a lot with, I think Cold Heart is the other journalist from Australia, who says a ton of people will admit things to him off the record or in private, but yet are hesitant to have their name. So it's this weird dance that everyone's doing. Is like, okay, what are the sources? Well, we can't name the sources because they don't want to be named, but then it's like really high up people. And did that woman in Maine, did she ever receive a psychological evaluation or anything to make sure that it wasn't anything going on? Did they do that, or did they stay away from it?
I suspect the Canadians did something along that line because the Canadian government was also interested in her case. They sent a fellow who was superintendent of the radio division of the Canadian government named Wilbur Smith down to spend time with Francis Swan. And he wrote subsequently a number of articles that mention this incident, this case, and Francis Swan. And I think some sort of psychiatric evaluation was done of Francis Swan during this period. And they found her, for the most part, to be normal, but she did seemingly have some delusions that other people began to buy into. But it was a curious case, not just because of what transpired in the 1950s, but because it became a sort of institutional mystery that was passed along through the generations of various government officials.
Mm-hmm. And I guess following that line, kind of almost the paranormal element to this stuff in Skinwalker Ranch, and you go in detail about what people saw, like wolf-like creatures, orbs, people having autoimmune disease after going there. And I've seen a lot of it when I've kind of looked on Twitter, and so it's kind of a garbled mess to me. Is people trying to use the paranormal element to disprove anything going on, like that's somehow taboo? You know, if you want to talk about aliens, well, maybe that's happening. But if you bring in kind of like a ghost or poltergeist, saying that immediately it's BS. You know, right. Look how silly this is.
That's right. Let's keep our boundaries. We must have boundaries.
Yeah. So how do you respond to that? How do you view Skinwalker Ranch, the cattle mutilations? Like, what is going on there? And I guess if you could give us kind of a brief overview and kind of what you found through either interviews or looking into that. Is that another case of people being manipulated by government or hoaxsters, pranksters, or is this indeed something odd, paranormal maybe that's going on there?
Well, I must confess, I haven't been to the ranch. I haven't been invited. I have interviewed people who have spent time on the ranch, and I do summarize all of the books that have been written about Skinwalker Ranch and all of the incidents that occurred. I sort of draw back for a moment, Scott, and look at this in a broader context. I mentioned earlier about the interaction with human consciousness and about how these various phenomena are part of a phenomenon that interacts with human consciousness. Let's start with Francis Swan and what happened in the 1950s. But that was an example of human consciousness interacting either with itself or with some other phenomenon that was going on because of the naval intelligence officer, almost like it was contagious, developing this ability to channel something that he had interacted with Francis Swan about. Let's look at some of the examples from Skinwalker. The hitchhiker phenomenon, which I find very interesting, which seems to be an example of a human consciousness interaction with some sort of energetic force. And what the hitchhiker phenomenon is, there were accounts from at least 5 different security officers that worked at Skinwalker Ranch and 5 different employees or former employees of the intelligence agencies of government who spent time at Skinwalker Ranch. All of these people have given accounts of having gone home after having spent time at Skinwalker Ranch. And in their home environment, many of the phenomena that they saw and experienced at Skinwalker Ranch manifested within their home environments. And these included everything from orbs of light floating around to poltergeist-like phenomena occurring, books falling off bookshelves and things being flung through the air and so forth, and the appearance of seemingly of strange animal-like entities outside the homes. I mean, these accounts start to add up, and you either think in terms of a contagion of delusion occurring on the part of all of these people, or because many of them are trained witnesses and are trained to be rational under stressful circumstances, that the accounts that they are given, which seem to jive together, that these accounts are credible, and the witnesses are credible. So then what we have is human consciousness again interacting with this phenomenon. Let's look at the Tic Tac sightings in 2004 involving the U.S. Navy. There are accounts from these various pilots that it seemed as if these objects were able to anticipate the intentions of the humans involved, the pilots involved,
Yeah.
end up at the rendezvous sites for these various pilots, waiting for them, as if they had intuited the intentions of the pilots. Again, it's almost a form of interaction with human consciousness occurring in a variety of strange ways. And I try to document dozens of these sorts of examples from the body of the literature of the UFO phenomenon, as well as the paranormal, as it's all evolved from the 1950s on.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And I think it's another kind of roadblock to traditional materialistic science is that when you start bringing in consciousness, because I interviewed another doctor who researches NDEs, near-death experiences, and another doctor from the University of Virginia who does research on consciousness. And I feel like that's not even settled in any way. So then you try to like bring that into it. And I think it makes perfect sense. And I don't know, is that something that Jacques Vallée also kind of believes too? And I know there's like a dimensional element to this stuff. Is that kind of in line with his thoughts?
Yeah. Well, his book, Passport to Magonia, for example, is a good example where he talks about the interaction between human consciousness through myths and legends and the UFO phenomenon. Let me give you another example. I have some old copies from 1979, 1980 of my magazine, Second Look. And we serialized Jacques Vallée's book, Messengers of Deception. And here was the headline on one of the serializations. And it reads, UFOs as a byproduct of human consciousness.
Interesting.
Back in the late 1970s, Jacques Vallée, as well as myself and others, were talking about this interaction between UFOs and human consciousness. The entire abduction phenomenon seems to be another big example of human consciousness interacting with this phenomenon, because whatever this energetic force is, and to the extent that we can materialize it, and there are individuals that seem to be skilled at seeking this materialization consciously, whatever is going on, the impact on the human belief system, on the consciousness, our conscious awareness of the entire phenomenon has been evolving decade after decade to the point that we've reached this level of awareness where what we call disclosure seems to be accelerating.
How would we look at physical abductions that are viewed by a lot of different people, and then kind of the effect on consciousness where maybe one person's getting channeled through? Do you view that as whatever this is, if it is indeed happening, an ability to, I guess, what's the play between a dimension, like, right, something kind of popping into our realm of existence and visual, or we are able to pick it up with our sensory abilities versus something that's maybe just communicating with one individual person?
So an author from the 60s and 70s named John Keel wrote a series of books about different energies and how these different energies, different layers of our awareness might be responsible for this interaction that's occurring. On top of that, other theorists have added the interdimensional angle to this, that perhaps what we are experiencing is an energetic force that is able to interdimensionally interact with human consciousness. And that what we see is evidence that is partly material manifested in our realm, but partly in a non-material form, what one might call spiritual, or what might be evidence of a projection of an energy. Another aspect of this dealt in 1959 in his book called Flying Saucers. The great Jungian psychologist Carl Jung, who talked in terms of the collective unconscious, was one of the first to really look at human consciousness interacting with the UFO phenomenon from the standpoint of how all of this might be a projection in the evolutionary scheme of things from the collective unconscious of humankind, in which all of our hopes and fears about the future are being projected. The Buddhists, the ancient Buddhists, have a term for this. It's called the Tibetan Buddhists, the tulpas. Tulpas were projections from human consciousness and awareness that were partly material, that manifest, and partly not. So there are belief systems going back thousands of years about what this phenomenon might be.
I mean, do you have any hope that science or researchers are going to ever crack this in that sense, or is this going to be something that's always kind of on the edge of our understanding? Once you get into that consciousness, and that's kind of a more, I guess, broad question. And I same questions I have for the near-death experience researchers and stuff, and it's so difficult to find. If we were ever in a materialistic society and people aren't really looking, or you can't measure this stuff, do you have any hope that this would ever be, I guess, proven in any way? And I guess that kind of makes sense to why maybe the CIA and all these different people, because isn't there a history of them being really interested in this kind of psychic phenomenon, people being able to control different things, so interested when these things pop up to investigate them and to see if there's anything. I mean, because the outside people go, oh, this is just, woo-woo kind of goofy stuff that, you're never going to be able to prove. How do you feel about that?
I'm someone who doesn't feel like he has to have an opinion about everything. I'm quite content with the gray areas of the mysteries and sort of traversing and exploring those realms. So I don't have a sense of that. I'm an optimist by nature. I'm hopeful by nature. But I sense that human evolution is accelerating. I mean, sometimes with violence, it seems like there's devolution occurring, and the baser instincts of humanity are always on display. But at the same time, I believe that consciousness is evolving faster, and technology is accelerating that evolution. And so the cutting edge of our awareness of mysteries about life is constantly being moved forward. It's not that we're going to have firm answers, but the clues are accumulating faster, and the evidence is becoming more concrete. So even if we are wrong about the underlying nature of the phenomenon, we still have enough to grasp where our curiosity and our awe about what is possible is going to continue to be a part of human awareness that we can actually tangibly grasp.
How would you view, I guess, cattle mutilations in all this? Do you think that's just an extra layer of somebody going, this is going to be funny if we just, I mean, there's reports about how finely things are cut, no helicopters you mentioned, and all these different other things. I don't know, it's when on one hand we have the consciousness, on the other hand you have kind of a, not barbaric, but a pretty, I guess, gross way of studying animals, maybe, if it's an alien, if it's, people playing a hoax. Have you seen any evidence that might lead one way or another?
My father was a cattle rancher in Texas, and I grew up around cattle and on a ranch. And I can remember back in the 70s when cattle mutilations first became a subject of public fixation, asking him, what he thought of the phenomenon, and he sort of scoffed at it, and he said, "Oh, well, these are ranchers that have a problem with their cattle, and they're just trying to file insurance claims." So there was always this attitude among ranchers that it was not something to be taken seriously, because my father always used to talk in terms of how surgical precision. I've seen coyotes do it, I've seen vultures do it, et cetera, et cetera. And then I tried to reason with him, but Dad, you never had your cattle examined after these sorts of mutilations. So how can you be certain that it was a predator's? And he had no answer, of course. So it usually wasn't until a cattle rancher had some of their livestock mysteriously killed in this manner and drained of blood, et cetera, and all of the symptoms and evidence that we've heard over time, that they became believers. So there was a marked contrast in the cattle industry about this particular phenomenon. Let's look at it and stand back for a moment from a broader perspective. If this phenomenon, whatever it is energetic in nature and involves microwaves and radiation and the spectrums of light that we can't visually see, and that it's interdimensional in nature, and that it's sporadic in nature, and that to some extent it can, because of the interaction with human consciousness, be triggered or even summoned, then what we see by way of a mystery in this particular realm, very much like what we see with crop circles, could be evidence of this energetic force trying to communicate with us using symbols and using evidence that we can't ignore. Sometimes human beings, in order to have the awareness and have the blinders broaden, have to be literally hit over the head by a 2x4 of evidence and an incident that can't be ignored. And when it happens again and again in a repeatable process, then we're starting to see something that can't be easily dismissed as a contagion of delusion.
So in your opinion, cattle mutilations, it's been thoroughly investigated in terms of like a terrestrial cause. Like there isn't, like you said, there's drained of blood. There's no helicopters in the area. There's no like footprints or whatever around their truck marks. Do you believe it's been, to the best of our knowledge, investigated to the point of it's still a legitimate phenomenon that needs more?
I think it's still an open question.
Okay.
Most of these various aspects of the phenomenon are still open questions in my view.
What do you think of Dr. Eric Davis? And I know he's been linked I think he's been to Skinwalker Ranch. I want to say I saw a couple things about him and mentioning it. And I saw some people trying to discredit him because he was buying into the paranormal element of that, or saying that like this is legit, at least the reports. Have you ever spoken to him? Or I know he's kind of an elusive person. And what do you think about just his whole involvement in this UFO issue?
I've known Eric Davis for, more than 20 years. He's currently associated with Harold Putoff down in Austin, Texas, involved in a lot of cutting edge science. So, Eric's an interesting character. I'm not sure how far I can go and what I can say. He has a legitimate interest in the UFO phenomenon and in the paranormal, because he is one of those individuals, based on personal experience, who has seen a merger between the areas. He doesn't make a separation. He did at one time. His background is in astrophysics, and he very science in the 1990s, very science oriented and rational in everything that he did. But like many people, he's undergone a transformation the more intimately and closely involved with the phenomenon he's been.
And please do tell me, if you can't answer, you don't want to talk about it, because I just, from an outside perspective, he seems like a very extremely intelligent person, a good reputation. And so when he comes out and says things like, "Hey, I've seen certain things where I believe it is extraterrestrial, or it is something we can't explain. This isn't human origin or a government program," would you believe him, knowing him for 20 years?
Mm-hmm. I would. I think he is credible. Just to go back in time, I had contact with him over the Francis Swan Naval Intelligence CIA memo back 20 some odd years ago. That was the first connection I had with him. And he had information that I wanted to share publicly, and I had information that he wanted to share privately. And so we did an exchange at that time. And in my encounters and interactions with him at that time, I found him to be rather thorough, and he was someone who was able to identify the legitimacy and the importance of pieces of information, like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, and to piece it all together in a way that was very coherent.
Mm-hmm. And correct me if I'm wrong, but was he linked to the Admiral Wilson memo and that whole debacle about, hey, he said this privately, but he's denying it publicly? What was that whole issue about? Because I still see that debated, and I still see that as almost people on Twitter were just going it to the point where, hey, if I can disprove this, and the whole thing is false. It was an odd focus, I think, for me personally, because I tend to look at it broadly, and you can't like just cherry pick something as this proves it or disproves it. But can you, I guess, briefly explain the whole Admiral Wilson thing and what the issue with that is?
Well, Admiral Wilson became the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He was head of it for a couple of years. And the controversy goes back to Eric Davis and Dr. Stephen Greer and a few other people having a meeting in the Pentagon office. According to the notes from this meeting in the aftermath, the individuals involved claim that Admiral Wilson made a number of admissions that had never been made before about what the United States government had in its possession, in particular certain military services that were residues of UFO crashes, in particular Roswell. And these admissions allegedly had to do with different metals that had been the residue that were acquired and had been tested. The memo that Eric Davis wrote about this particular, actually it was a series of interactions that Eric Davis had personally by himself, and then with Dr. Stephen Greer and others at the Pentagon. A summary of all of this was written by Eric, and it was given to Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 moonwalker. Mm-hmm. And with the understanding that it would not be released publicly. After Edgar Mitchell died, his papers were acquired through the family by some UFO researchers who ultimately revealed this memo that had originally supposedly been private. And once it became public, Admiral Wilson denied everything. He denied having stated what allegedly he said to these witnesses. He actually initially denied even having the meetings that he had with these witnesses. So the controversy erupted at that time, and there were some UFO investigators who tried to disparage Eric Davis and his memo. But I must confess, I can't go into a lot of the details about this. I must respect Eric Davis's privacy, but that sort of a general overview of what transpired.
Could I ask you, based on everything that's been said publicly and maybe some things that you're privy to privately, where do you stand on this? That Admiral Wilson did say these things and that he's just trying to cover himself publicly?
Well, I have to go back to my experience with Arthur Lundahl of the CIA when he denied to me what he admitted privately to others. I greatly suspect that the same thing happened with Admiral Wilson, that he made some admissions privately and he thought it was going to remain private. When it didn't remain private, went public, he did what Arthur Lundahl did. He denied it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where you said the preponderance of evidence starts to get very heavy in one direction, where you start thinking like, hey, this is not just projects or whatever else. I guess this kind of leads us into and we can, I guess I touch on some other older stuff too, but the present day whistleblowers, the Elizondos, the Mellons, even you, I think, mentioned before, why are ex-CIA people coming out and then saying certain things? Can we trust it? I think it was Brennan from the CIA has said things publicly about the UFO phenomenon. Radcliffe has come out and said, referenced the fast walkers satellites have picked up in outer space. I find this whole thing, there's so many people who've been in high levels of government saying like, hey, this is legit. But there's always a voice in the back of the head going, are they misleading us? Is this part of it? But then it'd be so damaging to all their reputations. How do you feel about this whole disclosure movement by the government and all these people coming out and saying these things? And do you think we're being manipulated?
I think the manipulation has been ongoing from the very beginning. It's the nature of this controversial, mysterious subject area that people have hidden agendas and people have self-interest involved in their reputations that they want to enhance or protect. So, yes, I do think there's always an element of manipulation, even when we have, quote unquote, full disclosure, whatever that means, whatever that really looks like. I think even that's going to be a manipulation. Do you think
they will ever... I guess, do you think we should be listening to, I think someone like Elizondo has taken a lot of heat lately and they're saying like, oh, are you just, a psyops operation, trying to mess with us? Do you think it's wise for us? I mean, I'm sure being an open-minded person, you're like, you listen to what they say and weigh the evidence. I just find it, the only pitfall I could see is if maybe they're all getting the information from like a couple sources in the high levels of government and then they're disseminating it down. And so maybe they're being manipulated and therefore we are. Or do you think it's been a wide, broad, I guess, collection of evidence over years that, hey, we can trust some of this stuff?
I think the layer of bureaucratic cover-up that myself and all the other researchers over time have either overlooked or failed to adequately consider has to do with the private sector as an appendage of the intelligence agencies of government. I'm thinking in terms, in particular, of aerospace corporations that have had contracts and subcontracts with the military and the intelligence arms of government that have been involved in the UFO phenomenon. And more recently, we've had evidence that there are some unnamed aerospace corporations that might have alleged metal residue relating to UFO crashes, UFO sightings, etc. And that we're finally getting a peek at the extent to which there are these interconnections. And because the contractors and subcontractors in the civilian sector aren't subject to the Freedom of Information Act, or even to much of the oversight by Congress, that this is a realm of data and information which mostly remains undisclosed.
Yeah, I've saw that in the reports about the private industry, and I was like, well, yeah, good luck. 'Cause I mean, I know there's, and I you mentioned him in the book is I think John Greenwald, who does the FOIA request and has gained a
Mhm.
lot of really interesting information. But I feel like there's an element there where you're going to hit like a wall, and you're no longer going to get any. I mean, because if there's really does exist, and they have materials or whoever does, I mean, they're not going to accidentally. You would think, leave it in there and like, oh, well, here's the information. I mean, how valuable do you think that approach is? And then where does it end in terms of the private industry? And will you ever gain access to that?
Hmm. Yeah, Greenwald and the Black Vault is very useful as a repository of the Freedom of Information Act requests and have been done over time, and then the releases in stages, the blackouts and then the whiteouts and so forth. All of that is useful to show the evolution of the limited hangout that has been occurring. So I don't in any way disparage any of that and its usefulness, but it only takes us so far because of the compartmentalization that occurs in the bureaucracies of government. And as evidenced by what I pointed out earlier in the history, how you can have groups of individuals within an agency, like the Christian Scientists in naval intelligence in the 1950s, who have an interest in a particular subject area and then use the apparatus of government in order to pursue their collective self-interest in investigating a particular area. We still don't know the extent to which that is occurring. But we know that Scientologists at one point were involved in the intelligence agencies of government, pursuing their own individual and collective interest for that particular group. We've seen it again and again, and I suspect it's still happening. We don't know exactly the identities of the groups within the bureaucracy of government that are pursuing these various agendas. And that's going to have to be part of full disclosure eventually.
Do you think that Brennan, Elizondo, Mellon, Radcliffe, that group, who even Romney come out and says some stuff, do you think they would be influenced by any of those? I know it's impossible to know for sure, but what you've seen so far, do you feel like they're coming at it from more of an objective, hey, I saw these reports and there's something to this, or getting influenced by any particular group that they may be involved with?
Well, Jacques Vallée had that term invisible college to refer to the informal associations of scientists investigating UFO phenomenon beneath the eye gaze of mainstream media and the public. And I suspect that is still happening to some degree. So the individuals that you have named, I have no reason to doubt their individual or collective integrity and intent in connection with what they are pursuing, because I think all of them ran up against a stone wall at some point within the bureaucracy, and that frustrated them. And so the mystery for them still remains, and they've simply decided now to go outside of the system to seek answers.
Yeah, there's all the rumors about old presidents being denied access. And even I think there was a story in there about, or a claim that JFK was assassinated because he was on the precipice of understanding or getting information or pushing. Do you buy into any of those as kind of, are there some hard facts that kind of show that some presidents were, trying to get the access to the information and they were just shut out?
To some extent, I don't buy the JFK conspiracy angle involving UFOs. I knew people in the 1970s that were pushing that, and I had conversations with them about it, and I could never find enough evidence, convincing evidence, to buy into that. Now, with Jimmy Carter and his administration, because as governor of Georgia, he had seen a UFO and had filed a report on it, he had always had a personal interest. And members of his staff had developed a personal interest in the UFO phenomena. And I know personally, firsthand, from my involvement with Second Look magazine and at the time in 1978 through 80 interviewing some of these individuals, not Carter personally, but some of his staff people, that they were pursuing answers and were being frustrated and coming up against stone walls, the high security, need to know sort of stone walls that were being thrown up. And Carter personally has admitted in the aftermath that he was frustrated as president because he couldn't get to the sort of answers that he sought.
And I guess that kind of goes with, I know you mentioned Tom DeLonge in the book, and, that's what always kind of trips me up is you have high level people saying certain things, but then you have this musician who got access to apparently, high level people in government and gave him really important information. Then I'm like, well, okay, he has to be being manipulated, or they trust him with this stuff. And I know you kind of go into that and kind of like maybe why he got access. Do you feel like, does that trip you up at all too, in terms of like, why would he have this? You have these serious people, and then you have Tom DeLonge, and he's a believer, and he there's the argument that he would like propagate anything fed to him. How do you feel about that?
Well, first, by way of background, I'm an investor in the To the Stars Academy, founded by Tom DeLonge.
Yeah,
and
interesting.
Last week, your timing is good, Scott. Last week, we had an online Zoom call investors meeting.
Okay.
And I'm a small investor. I only invested money in order to try to get as much information as I could from inside of that organization.
That's smart.
And so we had an investors meeting online last week, and I had been given an agenda, as everyone was in advance, that it would be a discussion, first an election of new officers, which basically was a re-election of Tom DeLonge and the other officers. And then it would be a discussion about ongoing projects of To the Stars Academy. And then there would be an opportunity for questions. Well, what transpired in this investors meeting last week was that we had the election, and we all had an opportunity to vote online. At the end of the election, they never told us what the vote totals were. They simply said, all of the directors, and Tom DeLonge included, of course, have been reelected. Okay, fine and good. I'm assuming that they were all being honest. But then the next step was we were supposed to have a discussion of exactly what was transpiring. What was To the Stars Academy doing? Were they doing something other than Hollywood-related projects? Were they examining, as they had claimed in the very beginning they would, residue from UFO crashes and coming to some conclusions about whether these were valid residues or not? So the report that was given was simply about Tom DeLonge's new project, Monsters of California, some new film that he has directed and will be releasing sometime later this year. And then after Tom DeLonge gave this less than 5-minute presentation about his Hollywood project, the meeting was cut off. There was no information given about any other project, UFO related, and no opportunity for questions. And so I had wanted to ask, about these other alleged projects involving UFOs. And so it was all cut off. In the aftermath, I started having this re-examination of everything pertaining to the Stars Academy and Tom DeLonge. And I looked at the references in my book where I summarize other books that mention Tom DeLonge and the history and so forth, and whether or not he had this sort of access that he claimed and how legitimate it was and so forth. And so for the first time, I'm having some large question marks, sort of like smoke signals in the sky, emerging about Tom DeLonge and To the Stars Academy. And I wish I could say that those were smoke signals that a high wind was going to disperse, but I can't.
Okay, so I don't want to put words in your mouth, and if you don't want to answer, that's fine. But do you think he's being played, or do you think it's just kind of more so just kind of, I know, because I know all these people like Elizondo, I think they all started with that, right? And they all left Mellon and stuff. Even I think his name is Nick Pope too, I think was another gentleman involved.
Yes.
Do you feel like he's being played, or do you feel like it's kind of not a scam? I don't know, maybe a more polite word for that.
My suspicion is I don't know Tom DeLonge, so I am just talking based on what I've seen by way of a pattern over time being involved with the Academy, is that he was definitely a celebrity, a musician celebrity who had a fixation, a fascination with the UFO phenomenon, was seeking a way to legitimize his interest in a public way that would give him more credibility in a realm other than music, and that he developed some connections, as tenuous as they might be, with various individuals within the government and the military, and they in turn were fascinated by him. Here is this musician celebrity coming forward. Let's see who he is. What does he have to bring to the table, etc. And I think over time, Tom DeLonge began to realize either that he wasn't going to be seen as credible, and that he wasn't going to bring to the table what he hoped to, or pry out of the government what he hoped that he would be able to manifest. And then his agenda changed. And he started seeing Hollywood as being a better way to take his interest, his fascination. I mean, he directed this film, this Monsters in California film. So he saw that as an opportunity to sort of make a transition with all of this, which is why he's not taking questions from any of us investors about what we invested in.
Why is the government making this so convoluted, in your opinion? And now we have, I think, the more public hearings that are coming up, and people are kind of like getting all excited again, like they did about the UAP report, which, I found the UAP report interesting in that they said, well, there's a portion that are unknown or we don't know what they are. But I mean, it was pretty tamped down. And I feel like this next thing will be too. How do you feel? I just don't understand the manipulation. And I don't know if maybe you can help me get my head around it. Is for them, if there is no UFO, if there is no weird phenomena going on, why not just say it? Like even, I mean, people go, oh, the military needs funding and they're stoking fears. And there's a whole bunch of different reasons why they try to do it. Well, you could just say that, hey, China's building their military, Russia's building that. We need to have a big war machine to fight this in the future and the satellites in space. It's really easy to not have to keep circling this mess and muddied waters. I mean, yeah, it helps you. I guess you hide things, but it's like, I don't know. I feel like it's really overly complicated, and it's 70 plus years of this stuff going on. Do you have an articulate case about why they would continue to push this and have government officials coming out and going, "Hey, there's something weird going on," when there isn't? I mean, why not just put it to rest once and for all, and just move forward with without having to do this dance? What do you make of all this? I mean, can you rationalize it?
I suspect we might get some semblance of answers next week when there is the UFO hearing occurring before the House Intelligence Subcommittee. Congressman Adam Schiff was quoted on it just in the last day or so as speculating that maybe we would get more transparency as these, I think there are at least two different Pentagon officials that have been called to testify in the hearing. And there's going to be a public session and then a private session, classified session. And the fact that they're still having classified sessions, I think helps reaffirm that the military, the intelligence agencies, the government, they don't really know. They don't have any clear idea of what the phenomenon is or what is happening. And they're going to be in the public spotlight next week, having to answer specific questions about what do you know, when did you know it, what are the implications for national security, et cetera. And I'm going to withhold judgment in answering your question until I hear exactly what transpires in the public forum next week.
Do you think part of it is that they're hiding things because of, you can just look at COVID and the reaction people had about running and buying toilet paper when they thought, a virus came? Do you think that it's partly because they don't know what it is? And if they do actually come out and flatly say, hey, we don't know what this is, but this isn't human, or whatever, that, something we're doing, that they're trying to avoid a mass panic?
Control. It's all about control. We've got to control the public fears. That was true all during the Cold War, of course. There was the fear mongering that occurred when Kennedy, running for president in 1960, talked about the missile gap. We had a missile gap with the Soviets, and we had to close the gap. Well, it turned out that there wasn't really a missile gap. So sometimes fear mongering is useful, and sometimes it needs to be placated and needs to be pacified. When it comes to admitting that there's a potential national security threat, but we don't even know what the threat is, don't even know the nature of the threat, how to define it, much less how to thwart it, then that becomes a whole new level of fear in the public mind.
Yeah, I saw, I forget who he was. He was a senator or a congressman, but he basically said, hey, if another country has this, if Russia had this, Putin would land on the White House lawn with some kind of new tech and be like, hey, we're taking you over. And you'd think that's China too. If something existed that was so much more superior, and you'd think, like you said, 10 years out, these different kind of programs tend to show themselves, right? The stealth bomb of the SR-71 Blackbird. So why haven't we seen some of this stuff that's been reported from the 40s and 50s that's like somehow continues? We never see this stuff materialize in any kind of war setting. Mm-hmm. It's kind of baffling too.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. I've just had this feeling that within the various agencies of government, military and the intelligence agencies, there's been an ongoing firefight of controversy between believers and skeptics and the people in the middle who are trying to sort through all the different points of view and reach a consensus. I think that's always been true, I think it's ongoing now. When you have people like Elizondo and Mellon come out of the bowels of government, so to speak, because they don't feel that they can get clarity for their message by remaining within an institutional framework, then I think that's part of the evidence that these fights are ongoing, and we're going to see some of it play out in public perhaps next week before this House subcommittee.
It's so nice to talk to someone. You've had such a long career, and you've had so many different connections, like whether it's Eric Davis or different interviews you've done, and to kind of get a window into the stuff, even if you can't, you can say so much. But there's been a lot of talk about high resolution photos being available. Elizondo's floated the idea a bunch, longer videos, all this different material that we just haven't seen. Obviously, there's stuff we haven't seen because things are classified. But do you believe in your conversations that these things do exist? Because people go, they exist. No, they don't. Yes, they do. Then they don't. And I have to turn it off because I don't know who to believe. And it gets frustrating as just a regular civilian who has no access to anything. Do you believe there's much better stuff that would prove without a shadow of a doubt, one way or another, if these things are actually in the air around us and in the water?
Well, bearing in mind that I'm just a regular citizen too, it's just that I'm playing a role and have been for 50 years as a journalist. So the access is a little different than the normal citizen. But based on everything that I've been told publicly as well as privately, there does seem to be a repository of more detailed, more clear information, including information in the photographic realm, which seems to indicate some sort of distinction that can finally be made in the public mind between what is speculation and what is concrete. I don't know the extent of it. I don't know all the details of it. Again, This is just what I pick up in conversation. And full disclosure is going to have to be something more than a cliche. It's going to have to be a determination that's made that transparency is going to be something other than a word that's used as an adjective. It's going to have some force behind it. And I think finally there's a will emerging in the U.S. Congress to force some of the agencies of government that have operated in the black ops realm to finally begin acknowledging the extent to which they are as baffled as everyone else, but they have more of a foundation to be baffled about and on. They are not on a shifting sand like the public mind and public opinion has been. There is a foundation of truth there to be seen and shared.
Yeah, because that's always the argument by, to use Tyson as another example, is that, oh, the photos are always blurry. Oh, they're, with everybody with a cell phone. And that's, I don't like that at all because, things have happened to me in the moment that are shocking or crazy. And I know it's like a thing now where people like to film fights or different problems that are happening on the street and stuff. But for me, I don't reach for my cell phone when something's happening like that. I have a kind of a shock moment, deer in headlights. I have to kind of take in what's happening. So if I saw something crazy, and I don't know, I don't think you can use that as an argument, but it would be nice. I mean, people are waiting for that clear photo from a fighter jet pilot, of this weird alien ship next to them or something. It would be so refreshing to see that. But then it's like, well, come on, like, why would the government show you that? Because,
Well, even if that happens, Scott, even if we get some of those clear photos of aliens and spaceships and portals and so forth, there's always, in this day and age, in this culture of conspiracy that we live in, there's always going to be a large element, a large segment of naysayers and people who are going to say that this is just manipulation. We can't believe this. We can't really look at this with a rational eye. There's always going to be some group of people that are going to disparage it and cast doubt and sow confusion. Again, this gets back to an individual decision that we each have to make. I don't know that there will be some collective decisions forthcoming, but we all have to make our individual decisions about what feels true.
That's well said. I just wanted to touch on, I'm reversing, but implants, because I know you mentioned that, and I had made a note for myself to ask you about that, because some of the stories in there were like, whoa, that's be really odd to find it up your nose or in your ear or something. Was that, when you talk about that, was that pretty fact-based? I mean, was that firm that this showed up in someone's body and no one knows how it got there? Or was this kind of like a subjective, this person said they had it and there was medical reports? I mean, or was this pretty firm that this was happening?
Key source for all of this was a podiatrist by the name of Dr. Roger Lear. He had written several books on the subject of implants and having surgically removed implants from various people, dozens of people. And looking at what was removed, they're all terrestrial pieces or residue of something or another. There was nothing otherworldly about any of it. And then it raises the question, if aliens were here planting tracking devices on humans for some reason, wouldn't it be a sophisticated technology that would be known to us, that would be recovered? That's the rational part of me, trying to analyze all of the pattern of evidence, that seeming evidence that emerged over time. And then there's the counter argument. Well, maybe, in fact, the aliens are using terrestrial elements as the tracking device in some way. And we're just not intended to figure out how it's being utilized. And maybe that's all part of the plan. The arguments become endless at a certain point.
It's very true. Like last few questions for you, and you can answer one words or expound whatever you would like. If you had to say right now, the ancient astronaut theory, are you for that being kind of the origin of civilization, or do you think that has nothing to do with what's presently going on?
Well, I'm going to answer in between the two extremes, between the believing and being a debunker or skeptic. I'll never forget being at an ancient astronaut convention in the late 70s in Chicago and hearing Eric von Daniken talk about how the pyramids and Stonehenge and the Nazca lines in Peru, all of this was evidence of alien visitation. And all the heads in the room, hundreds of them, were nodding in agreement. And I kept thinking to myself, this really demeans human intelligence and the evolution of human intelligence. It demeans the skills that humans have displayed over the millennia. So I find myself, to some extent, a skeptic. And yet, as I said earlier, intuitively, I've always sensed that there was some sort of visitation that may have occurred. It may have been short-lived, but it was represented in legends and myths that have been passed down in oral traditions through the centuries. So I suspect something happened, but I just don't find the evidence that's cited as being convincing.
Yeah. So maybe more of a kickstart, or maybe it's a few times in throughout the course of human civilization, but not every single thing we did that was interesting.
Or even, Scott, even some genetic tinkering. Maybe there was tinkering with our genes that occurred to where the various species of what we consider now subhumans, Neanderthals, etc. Maybe there was some tinkering that occurred to produce a hybrid species that became us, to evolve in an accelerated fashion. Why not? I mean, it seems like it's an open-ended question that we should at least consider.
And what do you believe? I know you kind of mentioned consciousness. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, your belief, maybe if this is all real, UFOs, UAPs, however you want to, what label you want to put on it, would be kind of our consciousness interacting with other entities in other dimension. Maybe it's a self collective consciousness thing, more so than, hey, it's ET coming from Mars.
Yes. It's like the old tree falling in the woods analogy. If there's no one around to hear the tree fall, does it really fall? That sort of mind twisting that occurs and discussing the aspects of that may be true here, where in the absence of human consciousness, in the absence of humans, would this phenomenon be occurring? Is this phenomenon intended to mirror for us human consciousness in some way?
If there's a case that you would direct anybody to, is there something that does it for you in terms of, hey, this for me says there's something to this? Is there a particular case?
Oh, there are quite a few, actually. There are quite a few. 1964, Socorro, New Mexico, policeman Lonnie Zamora, who saw a vehicle land, and he saw two short entities outside of the vehicle. That case, I summarized some of the books that were written about that case. That case persists to this day in terms of the evidence that was left, in terms of eyewitnesses, not just policeman Lonnie Zamora, but eyewitnesses who saw something fly and land in a gully. All of that is a really good case. There are many other cases that I could cite, and I have a whole list of them in the book, as well as many books that I would, on these particular specific cases, I would recommend to the reader.
And what would your kind of final thought be in terms of why, if this is happening, if this is all real? There's like, I think you float a few ideas in the book. Is I think John Mack, who we didn't really touch on, but he was talking about it's a gift that they're coming to us and interacting with us on a higher levels of consciousness. And then there was other people saying, well, they're trying to take us over slowly or fusing us alien DNA with like primate DNA, whatever it is. Based, I know it's speculation, but kind of what you've read, what you've seen, what would be your hunch as to what this is all about? Are we just being surveyed? Are they going to terraform the planet?
Well, I love all of the range of different theories that are out there, that it's time travelers, or that it's interdimensional, or that it's intended to accelerate our evolution in some respects, or that it's archaeologists from another civilization here, and sociologists who are here to study us. I don't have an affinity for any particular theory, although more and more as I get older, I get in my twilight years, the interdimensional aspect of this, an energetic force that has an interdimensional portal entryway into our consensus reality, and that manipulates time and space, and that interacts with human consciousness. All of that together begins to feel more right to me.
Very well put. And I think it's funny at my evolution of this idea too. I grew up watching Spielberg films, and E.T. and even movies like Cocoon, which I know you mentioned in the book. And I don't know. I've definitely kind of gravitated more toward the consciousness and that being kind of a source and the dimensional aspect to it, and less about which, some present day physicists try to paint it as, hey, why would they come all the way across space and time when it's so hard to speed of light and everything? So I kind of gravitate toward that too. And I think the conversations around consciousness will be very interesting going into the future, and kind of maybe seeing these two join up more so than they even are now. Mm-hmm. But I urge everyone to, go ahead, sir. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to conclude, if I could,
sure,
with a postscript that I discuss in the book. And when we talk about malicious intent, whether or not this phenomenon, whatever it is, has malicious intent, my feeling is that the malicious intent that occurs and the repercussions of it, as seen in the lives of ordinary human beings, can be illustrated in a particular sequence of incidents that occurred in the wake of the Arizona lights in 1997. 13 days after the Arizona lights incident, the Heaven's Gate cult committed mass suicide in a suburb of San Diego, California. They committed suicide because they thought that the lights seen in the skies of Arizona 2 weeks earlier were the harbinger of a spacecraft that had come following the Hale-Bopp comet to take this particular cult away to the stars. So the sighting over Arizona that night, March 13th, 1997, triggered a mass suicide event among the 27 members of the Heaven's Gate cult. But that wasn't the end of it. A few days after the cult committed suicide, and I'm going to read you here from the book, Captain Craig Button, 32 years old, flying out of Tucson's Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, through his A-10, he flew an A-10 Thunderbolt 800 miles off course and intentionally crashed it into a Colorado mountain. Why did he do that? Because he thought the Arizona lights were an indication that the end of the world was near. And he had talked to family members about it, and it had had such an impact on him that he committed suicide and was hoping that his suicide, as being a member of the military, crashing an A-10 into a mountainside, would somehow wake humanity up. It's these sorts of incidents occurring in the wake of UFO sightings, whether the UFO sighting in Arizona was a psychological warfare event, a mass manipulation, or whatever it might be. It's these sorts of very human, real events that underscore how there is a dark side to this that we don't truly take into full account.
No, I'm glad you brought that up. When I was reading that, I was just like, man, I mean, my first thought was if you expound that over 70 plus years, this stuff's been going on and maybe the government covering things up and destroying lives. And so you want to blame the government. But then, like you said, like if it's a real phenomenon outside of them, how that affects lives. And it'd be interesting to see. And I don't know, I think Jacques Vallée discussed this at some point about if you zoom out and you look at the totality of all the different interactions with people and kind of trying to find a pattern about what it's causing. And like you had mentioned in the book, I think her name was Linda Cortile. Was that, I don't know how to say her last name, but the woman who was abducted out of the Brooklyn Bridge and viewed from the UN.
The Bud Hopkins case. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was really fascinating. And then trying to maybe on a high level influence a leader or a person who could affect change. So that stood out to me. But then I was like, well, gosh, why don't they just land somewhere super visible to everybody and you could affect the change that you seek? But then obviously that raises a whole can of worms in terms of how you're going to manipulate events if you were trying to do so. Mm-hmm. But do you see any patterns if you zoom out in terms of, like you said, either, I know there's a darker side to it, and then there's, I guess, if you weigh them, is it more beneficial when these things are happening, or do you see more of it's screwing things up?
Well, when I go to the 90,000 foot level on this subject, I start thinking in terms of a global mind, not just the collective unconscious of humanity, but a global mind, which actually is a subject that has been in scientific papers in the last few months. The February issue of an astrobiology journal, for instance, had some scientists from the University of Arizona speculating about what would a global mind look like and what would be the symptoms of it. And here's what I mean by global mind. If you take all of the consciousness of humankind and all of the animal species and all of the plants, everything that has reflexes and that has any sort of awareness and intelligence, and in some total consciousness, and you put it together, much like the movie Avatar, there was a theme in Avatar that was sort of a global mind. Well, these astrobiologists have been thinking in terms of, could we identify extraterrestrial species and intelligence by looking for the impact of a global mind, and what form would that take? And there's been research done at Princeton University into a global mind effect at the subatomic level in networks of computers, to see if, when attention of humanity is focused on a particular event, does it affect the subatomic level of information in networks of computers? And in fact, evidence was found based on 9/11 in particular, as well as other world events, that there was an impact. There was a change in the patterns of numbers, the pluses and minuses in random number generators in networks of computers. So we're slowly accumulating evidence of a global mind. And maybe it's that global mind that we are really, as individuals and as a species, interacting with.
It's really fascinating. Such a fascinating subject. And I just want to thank you again for coming on, and thank you for staying a little bit later and talking to us about everything, your knowledge. And it's really been nice to get an insight. Again, everyone, the book is Alien in the Mirror, Extraterrestrials, Contact Theories, and Evidence. Please go check it out. It's an excellent book. If anybody wants to find you or follow you website-wise, I know social media, do you have anything where people could kind of look you up?
The website is alieninthemirror.com.
Okay. Yeah, I was looking through your books and I saw some other really interesting topics that you've covered in the past. And I was like, if you ever want to come on and discuss, I'd be happy to have you back on, even to discuss more evolutions in this topic.
Well, one of my favorite subjects, Scott, is luck and intuition, and the merger between luck and intuition as it plays out in games of chance.
Oh, yeah. What was the book, I guess, you wrote about that?
Lucky You.
Lucky You, that's right.
And I have a sequel to that book coming out this summer, by the way.
Oh, cool. Well, I'll have to check it out. And then maybe if you would like to come back on, I'd love to have you and we can discuss more at length about all those different topics.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, pleasure to have you on. Thank you.